Chapter 6, Part 1 of All in the Day's Work by Ida Tarbell. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. I Fall in Love. Falling in love with Paris at first sight, a coup de feu it was, in no way dimmed the energy and the care with which, on the day of my arrival, I began to put into operation the cautious and laborious plan for self-support I had brought along. It rather intensified it. As I must begin at the bottom to build up contacts with strangers on the other side of the ocean, and as there was but $150 in my pocket, there was no time to waste. In the 10 years I had been trying to support myself, I had learned that the art of spending money is quite as important in a sound financial program as the art of earning it. I had been going on the theory, as I still am, practice is another story, that what I earned must cover my expenses and leave a surplus for emergencies and expansion. I had applied my principles to my small salary on the Chautauquan, never over $100 a month, well enough to get myself to Paris and have this little reserve to care for myself while I was proving or disproving that I could convince a few American editors, whom I had never seen, that my goods were worth buying. The first step, obviously, in carrying out my program was cheap living. Luckily for me, 2 of my associates on the Chautauquan, excited by my undertaking, had decided to join me. One, Josephine Henderson, was a friend of Titusville days and, like myself, a graduate of Allegheny College. Jo, as we called her, was a handsome woman with a humorous look on life, healthy for me. I have never had a friend who judged my balloons more shrewdly, or pricked them so painlessly. With us was a beautiful girl, Mary Henry, the daughter of one of the militant WCTU workers of that day, a neighbor and a friend as well as a co-worker of the great temperance leader, Francis Willard. At the steamer, a friend of Mary's appeared, announcing that she too was going along. This meant 4 of us to share rent and food. Back in Titusville, I had picked on the Latin Quarter, as at once the cheapest and the most practical place in Paris for one to live who must go on the cheap. Then, too, the university was in the Latin Quarter, and we were all planning to take lectures. I was even flirting with the idea that I might find time to take a degree. So, on arrival, putting our bags in the little room of the cheap hotel on the right bank to which we had gone, we headed at once for the Latin Quarter. I had picked on the neighborhood where I wanted to settle, near the Musée de Cluny. Not that I knew a thing about the Musée or what was in it. Simply, Cluny was one of the words that had always pulled me. This magic was largely responsible for our settling in the Rue de Sommerard, almost next door to the spot in the city which, save one, was to have the greatest fascination as well as the deepest consolation for me. But finding these quarters was no easy task. My friends gulped, as I did, at the stuffiness, the dinginess, the primitive sanitation, the obvious fleas, and the suspicion of other unmentionable pests in the places at which we looked. But settle I would, and so, with groans, they consented finally to the taking of 2 tiny bedrooms, a salon, along with the use of a kitchenette, in one of the 4 apartments controlled by a Madame Bonnet. Our selection was not as unwise as it looked at the moment. Indeed, as it turned out, Madame Bonnet remained my landlady throughout the coming 3 years. As quickly as we had found our lodging, we established relations with the little shops in the neighborhood, where one could, for a few sous, buy all the makings of a meal. You bought exactly what you needed and no more: a single egg, 1 roll or croissant, a gill of milk, 2 cups apiece of café au lait, never having a drop left in the pot. Brought up as we had all been at loaded tables, the close calculation shocked us at first as something mean, stingy. Why, the very scraps from a meal at home would feed us here. And that was true. More shame to our bringing up. But we learned to buy as our thrifty neighbors did, and to like it. And we learned how to order at the cheap and orderly little restaurants of the quarter so as to get a sufficient meal of really excellent food for a franc, then 19 cents, or, as we carelessly reckoned it, 2,100 centimes to a franc. Only on grand occasions did we allow ourselves 2 francs. The pleasantest and most profitable part of the experience was the acquaintances we made with the women who kept the little shops, the little restaurants. As soon as they were convinced of our financial responsibility and our social seriousness, they became friendly. A friendliness not based on the few sous we were spending so carefully, but on interest and curiosity. We were new types to them. But once convinced we were what we pretended to be, they treated us with a deference quite different from the noisy greetings they gave the people of the neighborhood, or their rather contemptuous familiarity with the occasional cocotte who strayed in. That is, we were very soon placed by the shopkeepers of the vicinity. It was my first lesson in the skill, almost artistry, with which all classes of the French people classify those with whom they are thrown in contact, notably foreigners. Later I was to observe this in the more highly developed classes where I established professional relationship. I was a stranger seeking information, an American journalist, a student, so I told them. But what kind of person was I? What was there in me they could tie to, depend upon? Obviously I was not rich. If I had been, there would have been quickly gathered around me a group to offer entertainment as well as treasures to buy. But it was clear I had little money, so that was out of the question. There are other things by which the French label you, a woman particularly: charm, beauty, chic, l'esprit, seriousness, capacity to work, intelligence, bonté. Those with whom I had dealings for any length of time hit perfectly on my chief asset. I was a worker. A femme travailleuse, they said to one another, and if they passed me to an acquaintance, that was the recommendation. No people believe more than the French in the value and dignity in hard work. I was treated with respect because of my working quality. It was not saying that I should not have gone farther and faster if I had been a beauty, if I had had what they called charm and the fine secret of using it, but they were willing to take me for what I had. Being a worker, the chances were I was serious. I might or might not prove intelligent, but here they gave me the benefit of the doubt and waited for a final answer. That which they were slowest in making up their minds about was goodness, bonté. They were not willing to accept anything but natural, unconscious goodness, and it takes time to make sure about that. While we were finding our way about, I was at work. If I did not have the documents to prove it, I would not believe today that just a week after arriving, and in spite of the excitement and fatigue of settling, I had written and mailed 2 newspaper articles. Enamored as I was of the city, no work could have been more satisfying than that I had laid out for myself. My little self-directed syndicate concerned itself with the practical, everyday life of the city. One is always keen to know all the common things about the thing or person one loves. How did Paris keep herself so clean? What did she eat and drink, and where did she get it? How much did it cost her? Where did she go for fun? How did she manage it that even her very poor seemed to know how to amuse themselves, that her beggars were a recognized institution? There were a multitude of things I thirsted to know about her, and if I could get my bread and butter in finding out, what luck! What luck! At once I became an omnivorous reader of the newspapers, and found to my joy that many of them felt as I did about the Parisian scene. They carried paragraphs as captivating as those that our New Yorker unearths for its fascinating editorial department on the city to which it belongs. Another discovery which surprised me was that my best source for illustration was the illustrated catalogues of the French salons of recent years. I wanted pictures of markets, of rivers, of beggars, of marriages, of all the things that people were doing as they went about their business. And what rejoiced me was that many French artists seemed to love the streets and what went on there in much the same way that I did. They loved to see Paris at her daily toil, meeting her daily problems, and every year they turned out pictures showing her at it. Later I was to discover that this daily life of the Parisians of different classes has always been material for able artists. The best illustrations I found for my Madame Roland in her youth were those of Chardin in the Louvre. My manner of living, the contacts and circumstances attending the gathering of my material for my newspaper articles, brought me, for the first time in my life, into daily relations with that greatest segment of every country's population, those whom we call the poor, and of whom, if we are well-to-do or if we are rich, we are so curiously unconscious. I had belonged in all my conscious life to the well-to-do, those who spent $1 without seriously weighing it. Society had seemed to me to be chiefly made up of such people. Of course there were the rich, but they were so few in number as to be negligible. At least they had never counted in my life, nor had the poor counted as a permanent class. I had the American notion that the chief economic duty of the poor was to become well-to-do. The laborer, the clerk, the man who worked for others, should save his money, put it into the business, or start out for himself, no matter how hard, how meager the return. Dignity and success lay in being your own master, owning your own home. I am sure my father would rather have grubbed cornmeal and bacon from a piece of stony land which was his own than have had all the luxuries on a salary. One of his complaints against the great oil trust was that it was turning the men of the oil region into hired men. Mighty prosperous hired men, some of them, but nevertheless taking orders, even orders as to what to say, for whom to vote. To his way of thinking, this was a failure for an American. I suspect his philosophy working in me was at least partially responsible for my revolt against the kind of security I had achieved on the Chautauquan. I was a hired girl. But in the society where I found myself in Paris, there was no such contempt for the fixed job. On the contrary, it was something for which you were responsible, to which you owed an obligation. Serious workers in Paris seemed to me to give to the job the same kind of loyalty that serious men and women in America gave to the businesses they owned. You respected yourself and were respected in proportion to your fidelity to it. You might be advanced, but more probably not. Opportunity did not grow on every bush as at home, and if it came a Frenchman's way, he waited. At home you seized it, trusting to luck. Here luck seemed to me to have little or no standing in a business enterprise, big as it counted in the lotteries in which everybody took part. To my surprise, I found these people, working so busily and constantly, were not restless like the Americans, nor were they generally envious. I had a feeling that my concierge, who had never been across the Seine to the right bank, who lived in a room almost filled by her huge bed and its great feather puffs, who must have looked long at a sou before she spent it, would not have changed places with anybody in Paris. Were not the lodgers on whom she kept so strict a watch kind, generous, and regular with fees? Had she not friends in the street? Might she not win a slice of fortune one day from the fraction of a lottery ticket which she annually found a way to buy? And who had so magnificent a cat? The pride of the house. What more could she ask? Certainly there was more interest in the tasks, less restlessness, less envy than in the same class in America. Was it my father's philosophy which made the difference? Was it your duty, if you were poor, to struggle to be well-to-do, and if well-to-do, to struggle to be rich? It meant you were always trying to be somebody else. If it was your duty to be discontented, could you escape envy? Was it not necessary, if you were to keep yourself up to the effort, to feed yourself on envy, as in war men must be fed on hate if they are to kill with vigor and gusto? It was too much to believe that the content, the fidelity to the job were universal. Nevertheless, it was sufficient to cement the laborious poor into a powerful and recognized class, a class with traditions, customs, recognized relations to other classes, having its own manner of homes, amusements, worship, a class self-respecting, jealous of its prerogatives, and able in need to protect itself. But the multitude of hard-working and fairly satisfied men and women were not all the poor with whom I came close. There were those who could find no work. There were many of them, for the long world depression of the 90s was on its way. The winter of 91 and 92 was a cruel one, and the museums, libraries, lecture rooms, churches, where I went about my daily duties, were swarmed with poor souls trying to deceive the guardians into thinking that they had come to study pictures, read books, listen to lectures, to confess their sins or listen to Mass. The guardians only saw them when they became a crowd or attempted to camp for the day. Most pathetic to me were their efforts to make furtive toilets, taking a comb from a pocket to smooth tangled hair, scissors to cut the fringe from a frayed cuff. There were soup kitchens to keep them from starving, though many a one starved or froze or ended his misery in the Seine that winter. At one of these kitchens I officiated for a brief time. It was run by the McCall Mission in the Faubourg Saint Antoine. I was not there as a Samaritan, but as a reporter looking for copy. What could I do for them but tell Americans what a few Americans were doing in Paris to ease the vast misery? It might bring a few sous for soup. I believe it did. But they pulled less strongly on my sympathy than a class of the poor which I found to be in our quarter, men and women no longer young, past the employing age, who lived alone on tiny incomes, sometimes the fruit of their own past thrift, sometimes an inheritance, again the gift of a friend. I watched and speculated about how they did it, the more seriously because I asked myself if the day might be coming when I should belong to this class. If I ever did, I hoped I could carry it off with as much dignity as the one called the Countess on our street. She lived sous les toits, in a high house opposite me, a tall, erect, white-haired woman, in a gown and cape of faded and patched silk, which still showed its quality, as did its wearer. More than once I watched her stop, late at night, at the garbage can on the sidewalk opposite, turning over its contents. Many of the tradespeople seemed to feel that she honored them when she came in to buy an occasional egg or apple. She was so gracious, so completely grande dame. One day I heard the woman from whom I bought my café au lait say, "Will not Madame honor me by trying my coffee? It is still hot." She was pouring out a cup as she said it, and the Countess, with a benignant smile, said, "If that will give you pleasure, my good Marie." She needed it. Marie knew that, but Marie was more than paid by that smile. "It is a great honor," she told me, lest being a foreigner I did not understand the Countess, "to have so great a lady come into one's shop." There it was again, another standard than money, the standard of class, breeding, cultivation, the grand manner. The more I saw of the gallant poor of Paris, the more convinced I was, if they could get on, so could I, learning to live on what I could make. And I was going to make something. My doubt about that was set at rest some 6 weeks after my arrival, when I received a check for my first syndicate article, $5. It was quickly followed by checks from 2 more of the 6 papers to which I had submitted my syndicate proposition. 50% was not a bad percentage, and they were good papers: the Pittsburgh Dispatch, the Cincinnati Times-Star, and the Chicago Tribune. These 3 papers remained faithful to me until the election of 1892 compelled them to give all their space to politics. So they explained. I believed them, for they had all written me kind letters about my stuff, and the Times-Star, unsolicited, raised my pay to $7.50. Then the unbelievable happened. In December, a little less than 3 months after my arrival in Paris, Scribner's Magazine accepted a story. A grand Christmas present indeed, that news. Fiction was not in the plan, but one of the first pieces of work I did after arriving in Paris was a story born of a delightful relationship with an old French dyer of Titusville, Monsieur Claude. As soon as I had finally determined that I would burn all bridges and go to Paris for study, I had set about my preparation in thorough fashion. There was the language. I had read it fluently for years, but speak it? No. Could I master enough in the few months I had before sailing to find my way about? If so, I must have someone to talk with. The best the town afforded was Monsieur Claude and his mouse-like wife. They were flattered by my request. 3 times a week I went, and we talked and studied until they both were sure I could make myself understood in common matters. In this delightful association, I discovered that the passion of Monsieur Claude, the longing of his heart, was to see France before he died. He had insisted that I learn and almost daily repeat Béranger's France Adorée. Once in Paris, I understood him, wrote his story, sent it, a trial balloon, to Scribner's Magazine. The selection was made on a principle which young writers too rarely consider when they attempt to place their wares, and that is an understanding of the tastes and prejudices and hobbies of periodicals. Useless in 1890 to send a story on France Adorée to a magazine which was interested purely and simply in realistic literature. But the inexperienced writer frequently does not realize that. Naturally, I had learned in my work on the Chautauquan something of the pet interests of the leading publishing houses. I knew that Scribners enjoyed French cultivation, French character, French history. I hoped my sentimental title, France Adorée, would not antagonize the editor of Scribner's Magazine. But I had expected nothing from it, being in that state of mind where I had ceased to expect, only to accept. So that when I received a friendly letter from Mr. Burlingame, the editor of the magazine, saying that he liked the story, that he accepted it, I felt as one must who suddenly draws a fortune in the sweepstakes. In due time a check for $100 arrived. What excitement in our little salon when I showed my companions that check! Now, declared our beautiful Mary, we can move to the Champs-Élysées. And she would have done it, for she was one of those who always see spring in a single sparrow. We stayed where we were, I requiring a whole flock of sparrows to convince me that it was spring. The influence of the story on my fortunes was all out of proportion to its value. Most important was the courage it gave me. If I, a stranger, could do something that a great editor of a great magazine thought good enough to accept, why, after all, I might work it out. That which moved me most deeply, gave me joy that made me weep, was that now I should have something to show to my family. I had felt a deserter. Times were hard in the Titusville household in these early 90s. My father's and brother's experiences in the oil business, of which I want to speak later, were more than discouraging, they were alarming. My sister was ill and in the hospital. My mother's letters were saturated with anxiety. And here was I, the eldest child in the family, a woman of years and of some experience, who had been given an education, whose social philosophy demanded that she do her part in working out family problems. Here was I across the ocean, writing picayune pieces at 1/4 of a cent a word, while they struggled there. I felt guilty, and the only way I had kept myself up to what I had undertaken was the hope that I could eventually make a substantial return. If any one of the family felt that I should have been at home, there was never a hint of it. From them I had unwavering sympathy and encouragement. But if in 3 months' time I could do what I had done, and I made the most of it in my letters home, why, then they would see some hope for the future. Not only would the story help them to believe in me, it would give something more imposing to show to inquiring friends than the newspaper articles which had been their only exhibit. When the story appeared in the following spring, the reverberations in my Paris circle were encouraging and useful. I even heard of it from the other side, as we called the right bank, for Theodore Stanton, at that time the head of the Associated Press in Paris, came with Mrs. Stanton to call on me and tell me he liked the story. The most important fruit was that Mr. Burlingame looked me up when he made his annual spring visit to Europe. Here was my chance to tell him about Madame Roland, to ask if he thought his house would be interested in such a biography, if it turned out to be a good piece of work. The suggestion would have to be considered in New York, he replied. But he promised me it would be considered. And it was, for not long afterwards he wrote me that the house was interested in my project, certainly wanted to see the manuscript. This was enough to settle finally a struggle that had tormented me for many weeks. I had come to Paris determined to fit myself for magazine work along historical and biographical lines, but once close to the world of the scholar, surrounded by men and a few women who lived stern, self-denying lives in order to master a field however small, I was seized with an ambition to be a scholar. It was a throwback to my old passion for the microscope. I would specialize in the French Revolution. I would become a professor. But Mr. Burlingame's answer to my inquiry as to whether the Scribner Company would be friendly to a biographical study of my lady settled the matter, which shows, I take it, how shallow my scholarly ambitions really were. The Scribner connection was not the only one putting heart into me. Among my early trial balloons was one marked for McClure's Syndicate, New York City. It carried an article of 2,000 words with a catchy title, The King of Paris, cribbed from a French newspaper. It was the story of Jean Alphonse and his services to the city. The balloon reached its destination. The article was promptly accepted, with a promise of $10 when it was published. Also a suggestion that they would be glad to consider other subjects if I had them to offer, which I did. Indeed, I gave them no time to forget me. Not that they took all I hustled across the Atlantic, but they took enough to make me feel that this might be a stable and prosperous market for short and timely articles. When suggestions finally began to come from them, I felt the ground firmer on my feet. One of these suggestions led me into an especially attractive new field, and in the long run had an important bearing on my major interest, Madame Roland. It was that I try a series of sketches of French women writers. There was a respectable group of them, and I asked nothing better than to look them up. I began with a woman who at that time was introducing leading contemporary English and American writers to the French through the Revue de Deux Mondes, Madame Blanc, her pen name Théodore Benson, a person of rare distinction and of gallant soul. She had been a lady in waiting at Napoleon III's court, had made an unfortunate marriage, was now living on a small income and what she could earn by writing. In her salon there was a portrait taken in her young womanhood which charmed me, but when I spoke of it, she shook her head as if she did not want to remember it. Une femme qui n'existe plus, she said. Hard worker as Madame Blanc was, she found time to start me on my rounds among the French women writers. I doubt if there was an American writer of our day who would have had both the kindness of heart and the sureness of herself to take so much trouble for an unknown woman. She started me off, and I turned out 10 or a dozen little pieces before I was through. With one of my subjects I had an amusing flirtation. I think I may call it a flirtation. This was Madame de la Foy, who, with her husband, had done eminent work in archaeology, and who had a room full of exhibits in the Louvre to her credit, a very great person indeed. Madame de la Foy was the only woman I had ever seen at that time who wore men's clothes. It had been found necessary to put her into trousers for excavating work, and she liked them so well, and Monsieur de la Foy loved her so in them, that they obtained permission from the French government for her to wear them in Paris. From more than one source I heard of the sensation she created among servants when she came to call. They abandoned their duties to peep from dark places at the woman in men's clothes. Madame de la Foy and I grew friendly over the history of the exploits of women in the world, and it took no time at all for me to decide to write the history of women from Eve up, as if I had not already enough on my hands. She applauded my idea, gave me many suggestions, but it never went any further than my few visits, which, as I say, were more or less flirtations. She was such a pretty little man, so immaculate. The best tailors in Paris did her, I was told, that I could not keep admiring eyes off her. She used her eyes, too, and loved to pat me on the knee, partly, I suppose, because I always blushed when she did it. It was an amusing acquaintance, and a profitable one to me, for she was as interested in my plans for articles as if I had been one of her own. Another woman who interested me greatly was Judith Gautier. My interest was stirred by my indignation that her name had been left off the list of living women distinguished in French literature sent to the Chicago Exposition of 1893. There was much speculation among my friends as to how it happened. My own conclusion was that it was because of her long and impassioned devotion to the music of Richard Wagner. The first Wagner opera to be given in Paris was Tannhäuser. This was in the early 60s, when Judith Gautier was about 14 years old. She went to the opera with her father, Théophile Gautier, and was enthusiastic, although the house received it coldly. As they were walking home, a little fellow with hollow cheeks, eagle nose, and very bright eyes joined them. He rejoiced with cheerful violence over the failure of the opera. The girl, angered, forgot her manners and blurted out, "It is clear, sir, that you know you have heard a masterpiece, and that you are talking of a rival." "Do you know who that was, Saucebox?" her delighted father asked as they passed on. "No, who?" "Hector Berlioz." It was the beginning of a lifelong devotion. Wagner was to her not only the master musician, but a species of divinity. In 1882 she published a volume on him, valuable for its reminiscences. Early in the winter of 1892, Lohengrin was announced for the season of Grand Opera. I was amazed at the loud and bitter protests. Among the few lovers of Wagner who had courage to come to the defense of the master was Judith Gautier. She was abused for it. As this was my first realization that political hatred ever influences the judgment in matters of art, I took the incident very much to heart. I could understand why people might dislike Wagnerian music, but that the soldier should be called out to protect the opera house when one of his greatest works was to be given shocked me. You could then so hate an enemy that beauty herself was outraged. It was easy for me to conclude that Judith Gautier's name had been left off the list of writing women sent to the Chicago Exposition because the committee wanted to punish her for defending the works of a great artist in whom she profoundly believed. The opening up of opportunities so much more quickly than I had dared dream spurred me to longer and harder hours at work. There were few mornings that I was not at my desk at 8 o'clock. There were few nights that I went to bed before midnight. And there was real drudgery in making legible copy after my article was written. It was all done by longhand; careful and painstaking handwriting it was. I was to find later that Mr. McClure's partner in the syndicate, Mr. J. S. Phillips, trying to estimate the possibilities in this correspondent bombarding them with articles and suggestions, set me down from my handwriting as a middle-aged New England schoolteacher. But if life was hard and life was meager, and if down at the bottom of my heart it was continuously in question to which class of the poor I would finally belong, life, to my surprise, was taking on a varied pattern, very different from the drab existence of hard work and self-denial that I had planned and was prepared to endure to the end. It began at the Rue de Sommerard, where, at the outset, we stumbled on what turned out to be the most colorful, unusual, and frequently perplexing association that had ever come the way of any one of us. When we took our rooms from Madame Bonnet, she had told us that one room in the apartment was reserved for an Egyptian prince, who came only for the weekends. He was bien comme il faut, très riche, très everything desirable. He would not disturb us; we might never see him. Upon inquiry we discovered that all Madame Bonnet's rooms, save those we were taking, were occupied by Egyptian students of law, or medicine, or diplomacy. The prince himself, a cousin of the Khedive, was in the military school at Saint Cyr. He kept a room at Madame Bonnet's to spend an occasional holiday or Sunday with his compatriots, all of his age and all of the upper classes. We all shared the American flutter over titles, and when we caught a first glimpse of the prince and his friends, we were still more excited. They were quite the most elegant-looking male specimens, so far as manners and clothes went, that any one of us had ever seen. Here was more in the way of flavor than we had bargained for. We had come to study the French, and had dropped into an Egyptian colony. We soon discovered that they were as curious about us as we were about them, for hardly were we settled when Madame Bonnet came to say that the messieurs were all in her salon. Wouldn't we come in and make their acquaintance? Of course we went. They wanted us to dance. Now it was Sunday, and we had all been brought up under the Methodist discipline. Sunday was a day of rest and worship and no play, no amusement of any kind. In my household, at least, I was supposed to play only hymns on the piano, as we were supposed to read only religious books. My mother and I compromised at last on Gottschalk's Last Hope. She, being moved by the story of its composition, thought that it must be religious. But Martha and Poet and Peasant, my two other showpieces, were forbidden. Indeed, when I was 40 years old, my father, catching me reading a volume of a certain Congressional Trust investigation on a Sunday afternoon, reproved me in his gentle way. "You shouldn't read that on Sunday, Ida." I quickly exchanged it for Pilgrim's Progress, which is not without suggestion for a student of the Trust. My young companions were particularly shocked at the Egyptian's invitation to dance. I think it had never occurred to them that all people did not keep Sunday. "No," we said a little severely, "we don't dance on Sunday." I had the satisfaction of hearing them whisper soberly to one another, "Très religieuse." It was just as well, I thought, that they should have that idea to start with. Better than starting with the degree of intimacy they might see in our dancing in their landlady's salon on a first meeting. But we had what was for us an exciting evening, and when we left and they all begged, "Come again," we promised that we would. End of chapter 6, part 1.